Laura Cummings, Assistant Principal for Student Services at Glenbrook South.
And I'm Eric Etherton, Assistant Principal for Student Services at Glenbrook North.
Taking care of yourself is a top priority and necessary in order to help support our students. The webinar you will be watching next is titled Chronic Stress and Traumatic Loss in the Time of COVID-19, Supporting Students and Staff. It is presented by Dr. Renee Dominguez, the Executive Director and Licensed Clinical Psychologist at Family Service Center, and Dr. Cody Schraft, a Licensed Clinical Psychologist at Family Service Center. Both presenters have had extensive training and experience working with trauma survivors. The webinar will contain information to address issues related to COVID-19, including chronic stress and traumatic loss, as well as considerations for identifying and supporting students who have been impacted. Following this webinar, we will be offering 2 optional Q&A sessions on August 18th from 3 to 4 o'clock p.m. and August 25th from 3:30 to 4:30 p.m. These sessions will allow for processing of information learned.
Family Service Center will continue to partner with Glenbrook's in offering all staff members an optional touchpoint session on a weekly basis beginning the 2nd week of the school year. We will provide more detailed information shortly. A sincere thank you to Family Services for providing such quality information and support to our Glenbrook school community. Should you need any support for your students, please don't hesitate to reach out to the Students Counselor via phone, email, or Zoom. The Student Services Department's members are available to collaborate with you regarding any concerns you have regarding any of your students and are here to provide whatever support is necessary to help you and your students have a successful year. Please let us know how we can help you. We are here for you. We hope each of you have a great school year.
Our primary goal today is really to support you in this transition back to school. By providing some information that we think will be helpful in navigating these difficult and stressful times. So today's plan, here's what we're planning to do. We'll be talking about chronic stress and its impact, the way in which it's tied in to secondary adversities, especially during COVID-19, traumatic stress, traumatic loss, and secondary traumatic stress. And we'll clarify the definition of these terms as we go along. And we'll be working to provide you with information that will equip you to interact with each other and students through a trauma-informed lens. And we really want to be able to provide you some specific examples and strategies that can be utilized in the classroom, even if it's virtual. Okay, so a few considerations. We're going to be talking about stress, adversity, and trauma, which can be stressful and overwhelming. Good news is this is a webinar. It's recorded. You can pause and take a break. Do that if you need to. Certainly self-care is important. Also, we're presenting a lot of information with a lot of examples. So we want you to be able to take your time in implementing them and know that you're not going to take everything we say and go run with it, but you'll implement it gradually as you go through. We hope that this is the beginning of a conversation and that it continues after the webinar. FSC and someone from your district will actually be facilitating a Q&A session, actually 2 of them for those who want to continue this conversation. And those are scheduled for August 18th and August 25th.
So COVID-19, it's changed our lives in multiple ways, to say the least. And when thinking about how to support students, colleagues, yourselves, it can be really helpful to hone in on a few of the more important aspects of COVID-19, because to think of all of them at once can be very overwhelming, if not paralyzing. We've highlighted 3 primary needs we all have as humans that have been significantly impacted by COVID-19. One being sense of safety, a belief that an individual's needs and the needs of those they care about will be met, and that's about physical and emotional safety. There's a sense of connectedness, having relationships with others who make one feel understood and supported, as well as the need of sense of hope, expectation that everything will work out and everything will be all right. And at these times, we're currently in a state of extreme uncertainty about our safety, increased challenges for social connectedness, and a reduced sense of hope. So as educators, it can be really helpful to keep these needs in mind when setting intentions, focus, and goals for yourselves in the school environment. So for instance, asking yourself, what actions am I taking to meet these needs for myself, my colleagues, and students? One consequence of COVID-19 that impairs our ability to meet these needs is chronic stress. A persistent long-term state of low to medium grade anxiety that really impacts us on a daily basis. And on this slide, I've listed a few things that can exacerbate student stress, but I acknowledge that this list can go on for multiple slides. I'm not including everything. But what I have included is increased uncertainties and unknowns about a lot of different aspects of our lives, persistent changes that are occurring, an influx of new and often confusing information from multiple sources. Our well-established routines and expectations have been altered and changed in many ways. We're also experiencing increased togetherness as well as increased social isolation. And finally, blurred and hard maintained boundaries, just meaning that it's challenging to establish boundaries, keep them, especially for those who are finding themselves working from home more often. And what we've seen happen for many students is this experience of getting stuck in the survival mode and struggling to get into the thriving mode. That idea of feeling as if you can only focus on getting through a day then leads to this question of, well, how am I going to pass this test? How can I even think about taking the ACT? They can't allow their minds going there because they're just thinking of the next 24 hours, which is already stressful enough. And when anyone finds themselves in a prolonged state of anxiety and survival mode, you're going to experience negative impact on your physical well-being, so reduced immune system, getting sick more often, headaches, fatigue, difficulty concentrating. You're also going to have an impact on your emotional well-being, heightened irritability, and for some, this numbness, shutdown of feelings, and your social well-being, increased arguments happening, difficulty communication, and for some, withdrawal, social isolation. We also want to recognize and pay attention to the secondary adversities that are occurring that add to our levels of chronic stress. For one, caregivers are experiencing their own heightened stress, which is then going to impact their kids' levels of stress, which is obviously impacting your students' levels of stress. These stresses are coming from lots of different challenges, including challenges of being a caregiver role. And for some, that means caring for their own parents, for extended family members' health and well-being, as well as the financial challenges that are occurring. Students are interacting with each other differently, so that's impacting their interactions with peers. And this makes it harder to engage in that really important stage of development that focuses on peer relationships to the degree that they should be. And for many times, peers, students, high schoolers, they use interactions with friends as their primary go-to stress management strategy, and that's no longer available to them as much as it was before. We're also seeing changes of milestones and routine rituals. So graduation parties, summer vacations, they're looking different if they're happening at all. And that sense of recharging during the summer months that may not be occurring to the extent that your students are used to, and at times maybe are needing. There's the academic stressors that are adding to our chronic stress. So the stress of the remote learning, stress of transitioning as a ninth grader virtually, the changes in college application, as well as Zoom fatigue. That's happening for all of us looking at our screens more often during the day. Even happening for teens that would identify themselves as the gamers. There's a huge difference between looking at a screen because you're playing a game with your friends versus looking at a screen and listening to a teacher talk or a learning process. It can be very challenging. We also want to acknowledge and recognize the current tensions that are occurring in communities, both locally and nationally. There's a reduced access to resources of all kinds, from food, technology, internet, and engagement in community activities that are helping out previously with families and their well-being. And lastly, there's an altered access to stress management strategies that I've already kind of referenced, but being more specific of the way that we have identified ways to manage our stress before is just harder to access and looking very different. For example, we're not able to go to the gym to exercise as we might have done in the past. Others have identified going to the movie theaters and watching a movie as a break, and that's no longer available. So these are all adversities that are adding and influencing, exacerbating the chronic stress that's come with COVID-19.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about traumatic stress and loss. Traumatic stressors are actual or perceived threats to life or the physical integrity of the body. They're unpredictable, they're uncontrollable, and they often disrupt interpersonal connections. They actually represent a wide range of incidents. They're often sort of misunderstood as just sort of the ones that are most known. You know, you think of classic ones like physical abuse, interpersonal violence, car accidents, but really it's a wide range of events that can qualify as a traumatic stressor. And realistically, COVID itself functions as a potentially traumatic stressor to everyone. people respond differently to it, but it poses a potential stressor as a potential stressor. So a traumatic response is a biologically based response that can result in many symptoms, including, Cody's going to talk a little more about this later, but I'm going to name a bunch of them. They can result in many symptoms, including intrusive thoughts or images. So popping in your head, visuals of the traumatic incident popping in your head. Avoidance behaviors. People really work hard to avoid thinking about, feeling about, behaviors related to the event. They may show up emotionally disconnected. Is another way that a traumatic response might look. There may be changes in someone's mood and thoughts. They may develop traumatic expectations as a result of traumatic experiences. Another big category is physiological hyperarousal. And one of the ways in which people show up with physiological dysregulation and hyperarousal, so they kind of hypervigilance. People, I talk about it in terms of people being really jacked up, tense, having a quick startle response, quick to anger, really tightly wound. There's also often an increased sense of danger, and our sense of safety is compromised at varying levels. We question our own ability to protect ourselves and question ability of others to provide protection as well. Traumatic loss, let me shift a minute to traumatic loss. That occurs when there's a sudden, unexpected, or violent death or a significant loss, and then traumatic symptoms ensue. So this presentation was initially designed to address the impact of COVID-19, but I think it's important to note here that right now, in this moment in time, culturally, we all, your students are all faced with a myriad of losses that really could result in traumatic responses, including COVID-related responses, racial injustice-related traumatic responses. I think the video of George Floyd's last 2 minutes of his life have been played over and over and over, and I've heard people talk about the experience of that and treating on their experiences regularly. And then, unfortunately, you guys are also, we are as a community faced with the recent loss of one of your students, the stabbing of one of your students last week. So these are all collectively ways in which you have experienced traumatic loss, potentially traumatic loss, and your student community has experienced it as well. What further complicates traumatic loss right now, and quite frankly, just regular death and grief, is that mourning rituals are restricted. So people can't come together and grieve and remember and celebrate life in the same way that they have traditionally. And it really kind of slows down and can get in the way of that natural grieving process. And like Cody said, I think it bears saying again, traumatic stress, traumatic loss has really significant impacts on functioning, emotional, psychological, health functioning. We can talk about that for days, literally. And maybe not most importantly, but certainly importantly here is that when kids are traumatized and experiencing these symptoms, it's really hard to learn. It's really hard to learn math when you're feeling jacked up and ready to react because you're expecting something traumatic to happen. So it's really important to identify these students to get them the support that they need to address their traumatic histories and their traumatic experience. There's a lot of good research and evidence-based practices that can be supportive to them on a counseling level, but also in terms of the trauma-informed school level. So the other thing we want to talk a little bit about here, and just put it on your radar if it's not already there, is this secondary traumatic stress. This is something that anyone can experience when they listen to other people's traumatic stories. I love this graphic because it represents how we're all interconnected and how, especially in the time of COVID and social media, we're actually quite likely to have exposure to someone who has a traumatic story to tell, along with some pretty graphic visuals that go with it. And so when that happens, some of us will naturally take this information in, integrate it into our experiences, and consequently, we may experience a traumatic stress reaction. Even though it wasn't our story, we can still have that same reaction and it can interfere with our functioning.
Okay, so as Renee mentioned, with all of these kinds of stressors that we're talking about, it really can look different in everyone and even within ourselves over time. But we want to talk about what does it look like, what can it look like, because it's really important to start looking for warning signs. So then you can take the next steps to support your students, support each other, support yourselves. But what I want to first look at is focusing on what does it look like in yourself? Because if you're experiencing any of these types of stresses, and it's assumed that we are at some extent because of COVID-19, it's going to be really challenging to notice it in your students. Additionally, I'm going to be mentioning some internal experiences that you can then ask yourself, is my student experiencing this and I just can't see it because it's an internal experience? As mentioned before, also stresses impact your physical, your emotional, social well-being. So the warning signs, these primary signs we're going to talk about, are going to be reflective of those different domains. So on the next two slides, I highlighted various examples of what to look for, the warning signs. I'm not going to read through them all for sake of time, but I do want to highlight a couple of just the sense of reduced concentration and focus, which is going to naturally lead to abilities with problem solving and decision making. That's going to impact your work performance on days. And it also tying it in, as Renee mentioned, it's going to impact their academic performance. I also want to mention the spectrum of emotions. Some are going to increase their emotionality of increased anxiety, fear, danger. Others are going to be on the other side of the spectrum of numbness, shutting down their feelings, feeling like if they're not having feelings. So being aware of all of that. Next slide. You also notice a change in the difficulties of maintaining work-life boundaries. I've already mentioned COVID-19 is making that happen, but traumatic response to stressors, chronic stress is going to make that even harder. You also notice you may intentionally or unintentionally avoid people, places, and activities. You'll definitely want to pay attention to those things that you would have previously identified as something enjoyable. And lastly, that feeling of inadequacy of your sense as an educator, kind of questioning self-doubt of your abilities, questioning your value and purpose in life and kind of what you're doing. Those are going to be possible responses to traumatic response and chronic loss. Again, not everyone will experience all of these. Additionally, you might notice shifts in yourself. In that one week, you might be fatigued, feeling numb, withdrawn, whereas another week you're going to be irritable and anxious. So be compassionate with yourself, recognizing these changes can happen and taking action if you start noticing these signs and patterns. Next slide. When you think about students, we are recognizing that educators like yourselves are the frontline screeners, because you're going to be seeing them throughout the day more often than your colleagues of other roles within the school. So it's really important to remind yourself of this role of screener, meaning you're going to be paying attention to the warning signs and not so much getting caught up with the assessing and treating, because that's what student services as well as community providers like myself and Renee are there for. Additionally, reminding yourself that student services and other providers are there to provide consultation and support, really emphasizing you're not in this on your own. You have support and a team behind you. Something else to keep in mind too is students are really good at hiding pain and vulnerabilities. It's a really rare experience for a student to come up to you or anyone else saying, you know what, I'm experiencing chronic stress. I'm impacted by my parents' unemployment, or I'm going through some traumatic loss. They might not do that because they might not have the words to share. They might not be feeling comfortable talking about it, or they don't even realize it's happening. That just means they might not tell you what they're going through, but they will be showing you in different ways what they're going through. And that's what looking for the warning signs is. And when you're paying attention to these warning signs, you're going to be noting how do they compare to that student's baseline presentation, and is there a pattern? Now, that being said, it can be really hard to identify baseline, especially now with the idea of when was baseline? Are we comparing it to February before COVID-19? Are we comparing it to May when they were last e-learning? Is it last September because that was a year ago? And that just highlights the importance of communicating amongst yourselves as educators, communicating with other team members and within your school to talk about on a regular basis students' presentations, to work together to recognize changes compared to how they are right now to compared to how they've been in the past. I also recommend don't really get hung up with this idea of baseline versus patterns either. In the end of the day, if you're seeing something that seems off, follow up on it. But here are some changes that you want to be paying attention to. Difficulties with self-regulation, behavioral changes, so whether they're hyper-aroused or hypo-aroused, there's that spectrum again. Difficulties with relationships, they may be more aggressive or even may more withdrawn. The academic difficulties, again, reduced concentration, follow through, focus. You may note some changes in the consequence of changes in their appetite or sleep. Maybe they're looking a bit more tired during the day. Maybe they're actually falling asleep during your Zoom call with them, or they're complaining about headaches and stomach aches. I will acknowledge this list can be frustrating because these changes can easily reflect other difficulties like ADHD or just a bad day. And that is, again, why it's so important to maintain that role of screener and not feel the pressure to try to determine, am I seeing it because they're experiencing ADHD or trauma or loss? You don't really need to answer that question. You definitely don't need to answer it alone. Again, if you're seeing something of concern, follow up, reach out for support, talk to student services. And finally, in regards to this aspect of warning signs in students, Renee will touch base more on specific suggestions and how to elicit more information, particularly about that information that targets more the internal warning signs. Get them having conversations and talking about what they're experiencing, which that can be hard to do on just making observations. Renee and I wanted to include this slide about vulnerable student populations because we're all experiencing COVID-19 and the negative impact of COVID-19, but there are some groups that are experiencing additional layers of challenges. One being students with caregivers that are in the essential worker industries, and that's not just healthcare workers. We want to keep in mind the caregivers that are employed within jobs that didn't allow them to stop when COVID-19 happened, doesn't allow them to stay home and stay safe, or puts them in a position where they have to continue to interact with community members. This includes grocery clerks, postal workers, police officers, etc. COVID-19 has also clearly impacted our economy, particularly with the rise in unemployment rates. But we also want to keep in mind the students with caregivers who are experiencing underemployment. Do they have cut in hours, or is there a reduction in their caseload or clients, so there's a reduction in the commissions they're receiving? Those with compromising medical conditions are obviously having more challenges too in meeting those basic needs I referenced before: safety, connectedness, hope. For instance, they're unable to interact with others even with reduced social distancing restrictions that happen. When communities are able to open up with emergency orders, they're still not able to leave their homes as comfortably as others might be. There's the students that find themselves in really unhealthy or toxic home environments for longer periods of time and struggling and finding ways to get out of those environments when needed. Families experiencing limited resources, financial, space, food. We also want to recognize the students identifying Asian descent, as they're impacted by the explicit and implicit racism stemming from messaging about China and Wuhan, as well as the use of terms like Kung Flu. That's going to naturally impact how they're doing day to day. And finally, the students that are identifying within the BIPOC communities. They're experiencing heightened anxiety and a greater prevalence in loss because community members are dying at higher rates of COVID-19 subsequent to the multiple components of systemic racism. And that's all in addition to the impact from the long-standing racial issues that Renee referenced earlier that's unrelated to COVID-19, but is much more in the forefront these days. Now, all of this is not to say reduce your expectations of these students, expect them to be all struggling at higher degree compared to their classmates, but it is to say be mindful of their experiences compared to their classmates and the impact of these experiences on their academic performance.
Okay, so we're going to shift now and talk a little bit about trauma-informed approaches for schools. And we are going to pull this information largely from the National Child Traumatic Stress Network as our primary resource hub. So a trauma-informed system is one where all parties involved recognize the work to respond to the impact of traumatic stress on those who have contact with the system, including children, caregivers, staff, and service providers. Part of this process involves learning about trauma and its impact and infusing trauma awareness, knowledge, and skills into the school climate, the programs, and the classrooms. Essentially, this requires everyone working together: educators, staff, administration. And really the point of this is to highlight that you're not alone and that nobody is really expected to do this on their own. By even having a professional development webinar that starts to talk about trauma-informed approaches during this time is a way that District 225 is moving into a solid trauma-informed systems approach. All right, so where do we begin? As we think about showing up for work, so as you think about showing up for work and supporting the school community and the students as well, it's essential that you think about taking care of yourself first. You're not nearly as effective, we're not nearly as effective as we can be when our emotional needs are not prioritized. I think sometimes people confuse self-care with being selfish, and it's really not. Self-care is the sort of first step in being able to make yourself available to help others. And if you don't do it, you're really not able to do the kind of work that you really want to do and that you can do to support others. All right, so how can you promote your own physical and emotional well-being? One of the things that I think is extremely important is present moment awareness. We have a tendency to, especially when we get really busy, to sort of go into autopilot mode and just take care of things as they come up without stopping and pausing and reflecting on what's going on and making intentional decisions moving forward. So really key, stop, pause, and reflect what's going on emotionally, what's going on physically, what's going on internally, to make decisions about how you want to proceed. I think it's really important too to practice self-compassion. So prioritizing self-care is one way of having self-compassion, but it's also really important to cut yourself some slack. I think we're really hard on ourselves sometimes. In our profession, sometimes we say, don't should yourself. And also encourage you to give yourself the kind of advice you would give a dear friend who's having a hard time, which is kind and gentle, more so than maybe you are with yourself. Another thing we want to think about is the idea of loss of control and that being a sort of a core aspect of trauma, and how we're living in this time right now where we feel like we have limited control over our experiences. We've got the restrictions as a result of COVID, significant lifestyle changes. Cody talked about secondary adversities. There's all of these things that have changed the way we do things, and they haven't been ways that we've made changes purposefully because we had control and choice over it. But the reality of it is there are a ton of ways that we can exert control in our lives, in places where we do have some freedom to make decisions. And so we want to encourage you to find those spaces, focus on those spaces, and purposely and intentionally make decisions that you have control over. And quite frankly, that counters some of the impact of the traumatic exposure where you don't have any control. So it really creates a sense of stability. One of the ways that you can exert control is by using your social supports. So that in and of itself can be helpful, but it's also a way that you can exert control. You can connect with others. We know that purposely engaging in a practice of gratitude has a ton of positive emotional benefits. So taking some time to give someone some feedback and tell them that they're important to you and that they mean something to you and you're grateful for them helps you to feel better and helps them to feel better. One of the things that we also recommend is creating routines, which also combats the unpredictable nature of trauma and creates stability. If you can get up around the same time in the morning and go to bed around the same time at night, eat meals regularly, schedule in your exercise time at a regular time. The more you can create routines, the better off you probably will be. And your body will come to know that, and that will help it to feel more stable. The other thing that I would highly recommend is creating boundaries and balance. This is a time right now where we can be bombarded literally 24/7 with media, with news coverage, social media, lots of images that are overwhelming and unhelpful to us. So in the interest of pause, reflect, and intend, I want to encourage you to notice how you're reacting to your exposure to media, whether it's, again, news media, social media, whatever it may be, and notice when it becomes a bit too much, when you get activated, when it's not helpful for you. And think about how you can set up a boundary around that. Maybe you just go read the news. Maybe you have less frequent contact on social media. Along those lines, really important to consider limiting some of those relationships that are also activating and not helpful to you. We've got limited bandwidth, and how do you take care of yourself during this time? Setting up boundaries around relationships is also another way to do that. And then lastly, certainly following public health recommendations for your own physical, emotional well-being. All right, this next slide, we're going to shift into trauma-informed learning environment. So this is created by promoting healthy interactions and teaching social, emotional, and self-regulation skills. We're going to talk about strategies to support a trauma-informed learning environment. Establishing routines with clear communication is really important, and especially during these uncertain times. So what we want to do is encourage you to set up those lines of communications and be clear with your students. You know what? These are uncertain times. The communication and routines have changed at times, but moving forward, I'm going to be really clear with my communication, and when our plans and our routines have to change, I'll communicate with you quickly and clearly when they do. That gives them a sense of safety and stability, and it makes it more predictable. They know that you're going to reach out to them, and it's, again, grounding and stabilizing. Want to encourage you to incorporate relational rituals consistently across lessons. One way to do that might be to open up a lesson or close a lesson with sharing, having people take turns going around sharing one tough moment, a hopeful moment, or one thing they may have learned about themselves that day. This is a way that it's an easy sort of quick way that can help build and maintain connection with you, but also with each other as they get to know each other and learn about each other, despite the physical distance, right? The other thing we want to recommend is to provide information in digestible amounts. So, and from what I've heard from teachers as recently as yesterday, this is akin to you feeling like you're not going to be able to take on this remote learning and get through these lessons virtually. It's a new challenge, it's hard, and it feels a bit overwhelming. But once you break it down into bite-sized pieces and it's reinforced, it's more doable. And so being able to do that for your students as well is going to be helpful. Want to encourage you to use open-ended questions and curiosity. Give students a chance to lead the way in talking about their experiences. And doing this, it limits you imposing your assumptions on them. So instead of, oh, I bet online learning is brutal for you, you might say something along the lines of, I wonder how you're feeling about not being in school. Keeping it open-ended, letting them lead the way in sharing their experiences. A trauma-informed learning environment praises effort over outcome. So as educators, this is growth mindset stuff, right? So we want to praise the process, not sort of the final product. So I noticed you reported you worked 3 hours on that homework assignment and you got through it even though it was really hard for you. Way to push through. I love that you worked so hard compared to, hey, you got 100%. That's awesome, right? Process versus outcome. I think the other thing we want to highlight here too is that it's important to be aware that you don't know all the challenges students are experiencing related to COVID-19 and remote learning, and you just want to kind of keep an open and curious mind to be able to try to see what might be going on and provide opportunities for them to share. A few more strategies here. I think we all know that integrating social emotional learning and wellness activities can have really positive effects on students, and that this is especially true when experiencing chronic stress, adversity, trauma. That these activities can increase students' sense of competency, self-worth, safety, and can promote self-regulation, and also create a sense of control over the controllables, the things that they can actually control. So here are some few ideas of how to do this from the NCTSN. You might want to ask students to identify how they're feeling, sort of at the beginning of the class. If you're working virtually, you might share your screen, have a feelings chart up there, and ask them to pick a feeling, what they've got going on currently, and ask them to rate it 1 to 10. How intense is that feeling for you right now? That gives them an opportunity to sort of tune into their emotional experience, have a better sense of where they're at, and then to participate in class being sort of freed of that experience. Another thing you might want to do is engage in a shared mindfulness activity at the beginning of a lesson. I think this is such a lovely way to support the development of a skill that can be used across settings and can be helpful to students long term. So maybe you start off the class by doing some box breathing. Breathe in, hold it, breathe out, hold it. You would do it much slower than that, but do a few rounds of that and help your students actually experience the difference between how they feel when they start the class and how they feel after that activity, and notice the difference in physiological arousal, how they can calm themselves. You're helping them to actually develop a skill that they can take with them. It's kind of a nice, awesome thing that you can do, pretty easy. You can also set aside time to participate in a community building reflective circle. For the interest of time, I'm not going to go into the details of that. We will share resources for that so that you can do it, but essentially it's a group activity that facilitates environment building, safe environment building, connection to each other, a connected environment, gives kids an opportunity to identify something that's difficult, the personal strength that they're using to get through it, and as well as an opportunity to express gratitude. So all wrapped up in one. It's a nice activity. It's not a box breathing quick thing. You would need to carve out some time, but highly recommended strategy to support a trauma-informed learning environment. Might be something nice to do at the beginning of the school year as people are just getting to know each other. We also know that practicing gratitude, again, has a lot of therapeutic benefits. So one way to do that is you might encourage students to write down one thing they appreciate about someone else in the class, and then share the specific notes of gratitude with the students about whom they're written. Helps, again, students who are writing it feel good, and the students who are receiving it feel good as well. So informing students how they can connect to school staff to talk about safety concerns and encourage them to do so. So as Cody talked about, you guys are really important screeners, and being able to direct kids to where they can go when they're not feeling safe and when they have additional needs really lays the foundation for them to be able to speak up and ask for help. Another recommendation is to greet students by name and routinely use a touch-free or virtual gesture to support connection. So if it's in person, you might do an elbow bump. If it's, assuming with masks, if it's virtual, you might do a high five virtually, but some sort of routine way that you can connect. And kids can feel like students can feel like they're being seen. You can use virtual breakout rooms to create small group activities. So really like that idea, especially because it gives an opportunity for kids to connect with each other in a more intimate setting that's appropriate and gives them an opportunity for learning and connecting. Again, trauma really creates disconnection in a bajillion ways. So any way that you can foster connection and relationship is really important. And the other thing I would recommend is encourage students to get outside and move around. So if they can attend the class virtually, like from their backyard, they can get out and get a fresh breath of air and be out in nature. That would be great. Can they listen to audio textbook while they're walking or biking? That's another way to kind of get the body moving and supports a trauma-informed learning environment. Primary take home for this is really the importance of using your relationship and your frequent contact with students to connect, listen, and help. So Cody named this earlier on, that you guys have this awesome opportunity to connect with students probably more frequently than anybody else does. And that it's really a great opportunity to identify students who might have some significant needs that might otherwise be overlooked. Strategies to prompt and to address this. It's not your job to fix everything, but as a frontline person who can identify when additional investigation of issues and their support is needed, super important. We want to encourage you to communicate your concerns with your team, to identify high-risk students, to sort of give them the heads up. But we also think it's important for your team to communicate when they see, hey, student A is having a hard time, can you keep an eye on them, right? So there's a way in which the team can collectively support the student, watch out for the student, monitor the student. This is also another place, where reflective circle activity can become helpful in identifying when students are at higher risk and might need some additional intervention. And it also gives them an opportunity to identify some of their strengths and share some gratitude as well. As Cody mentioned earlier, it's important to monitor student behavior and, again, note the significant changes. Again, it's hard to know where their baseline is, but really being able to see shifts and changes should raise a red flag. And again, it's not your job to assess, evaluate, and create a treatment plan, but to direct them to professionals whose job it is. Lastly, utilizing student services for referrals and for consultation. it's really what their job is, and they're happy to be helpful. And they will be the ones who will know how to support students who actually have had experiences with traumatic exposures and are struggling because of it. That'll move the student in a place where they'll be able to be more engaged in the classroom once they get that help.
So more specifically, it's about understanding that culture and context, so past life experiences, prior interactions with school system, and expectations based on cultural background shapes an individual, and their it influences their presentation, which will include their responses within the academic setting. And this approach can be helpful at all times, especially during times of crisis and trauma in which we find ourselves now. Because one, it allows students to respond to stress, issues, concerns with a sense of trust and control within their role as a student, which then leads to improved decision-making, problem-solving, communication, and academic performance. It also helps you avoid blind spots that can result in unintended negative consequences despite well-intended actions. Third benefit is it supports you engaging with students from a place of compassion and curiosity, as well as avoid judgment. All of that helps you strengthen your relationship, which we've talked several times about. When a strong relationship is present, it results in a lot of different benefits, including student academic performance and engagement. And finally, the whole child approach recognizes that mistakes and misunderstandings do happen, and they will happen, but it allows you and your teacher-student relationship to recover, if not grow, when they do happen. So on this slide, it highlights some strategies, some do's and don'ts to support you in implementing the whole child approach. One, for the do's, learn what the students feel most stressful and most helpful by inviting them to talk about their individual and family experiences during this crisis. You can reflect back to Renee's suggestions on how to facilitate those types of conversations. Viewing students' experiences about themselves and their families as their truths, and then demonstrate empathy, curiosity, and concern when they do share. And finally, actively notice students demonstrating resilient behavior, and then pause to understand how a response serves a purpose in managing stress. And when it comes to resilient behaviors, they can all look different for everyone in their own way. And instead of asking, why are they doing this? Ask instead, how is this helping their stress levels? And then generally seek out the answer. Some don'ts to support implementing whole child approach is don't assume that healthy and unhealthy stress responses look a specific way. It isn't a wrong response if it's not what you perceive is the best response. So again, different does not equate to wrong. Don't convince students they're misreading a situation or only focus on the positive. This unintentionally minimizes their experience and ignores inequities and biases, as well as it contradicts the do above of viewing their experience as their truth. If you assume and convince them that they're not perceiving something as they say they are, that's unintentionally telling them it's not their truth and it's not really happening. And finally, don't assume students' responses represent how they feel about the class materials or themselves. This then makes you miss out on opportunities to really learn about their true experiences and support their options. By making assumptions, you might lead to assuming it's about the class and then telling them how to solve that problem. And you're not having a conversation truly about what their experience is and what best matches the next step, support, and plan. So as mentioned before, trauma-informed is not an individual task. It requires a team coming together and working together. And one team to recognize is your school staff, the team working together within the school. And this slide provides some suggestions on how to support that, but I highly recommend incorporating the other slides that we've highlighted with suggestions on facilitating collaborative communication. One being a feedback loop, creating an efficient feedback loop between educators and administrators to allow for an efficient means of letting people know what are some presenting concerns and needs that are emerging, as well as the services and supports to meet those needs. Share these services and supports in an easily accessible way, identifying a central location where a document has resources that you can add to it, pull from, whether it's a Google Doc or something shared on the shared network. And lastly, include a feedback loop with families to support efficient communication about from their perspective of their view of what some needs are, as well as efficiently sharing with them some resources and supports. And lastly, it's essential to include caregiver partnership. Research shows that the more caregivers feel a part of the community, the more they're going to be engaged and the better the students are going to perform. So this is because relationships, they're stronger through partnership. So some ways to foster this partnership between schools and families, caregivers, is educate them, give them information about common teen responses to stress, communication strategies, ways about modeling within the home environment. Maybe offer office hours because that provides structure and routine for communication between yourselves and the caregivers and students. Also talk with caregivers to identify communication strategies that work for everyone, that work for you, work for them, and then proactively plan and follow up as reminders about that plan, as well as make changes as needed. Things may look differently when we get into the winter months, the spring months, and communication may have to happen differently. You can also think about creating student groups or caregiver groups to facilitate communication. This can be really helpful if you want to address a common theme that's popping up to everyone. And these groups can help support communication between themselves. Caregivers, when they experience a communication or community within themselves, in that class, they can then share ideas and support each other, and you having input in that as well. And finally, recognize some families and students do truly struggle with virtual communication, not because it's just uncomfortable, but there's this element of you're entering their home, you're seeing them in their home, which can be very, very personal for people. So it can help to express gratitude and humility when they do provide you that permission to virtually enter their home.
Thoughts, a few cool quotes. Aim for Better, Not Normal by Michelle Norris on a recent Michelle Obama podcast. These are not normal times. Aiming for normal may not be where we want to go. We want to aim for better and know that we're not going to be perfect, but we're going to do the best that we can. Even superheroes have bad days. Children's book, I think you guys are superheroes and you're going to do the best that you can, and you may have some bad days, and that's okay. We want to encourage you guys to use the lessons you've learned from shifting to a virtual learning environment that you had in March, between March and June, and know that it's going to be different moving forward. You've had more time to plan and prepare, and it's going to be different and improved. And remember that you've learned some things that you can apply now. In this together, the who and how. Contact students, counselors if you have concerns, and feel free to contact Eric Etherton or Laura Cummings with questions or concerns.